Now let's talk about Lumumba, because that's the core of the story here. So as you said, he's born in, I think, 1925.
Mm-hmm.
He is born into and grows up within Belgian rule. And you mentioned that he did not get well educated, but he was he was a dense reader. He was in a lot of ways still a self-educated man, no?
Yeah, he was very smart. He, was self-taught. He joined a library. He read constantly, wrote a ton, was also a really skilled political organizer. Higher education wasn't permitted to him because of the system, but, within the limits of Belgian colonialism, he, achieved a remarkable amount and, became very politically skilled and as I mentioned, well-read.
And where did he grow up? What was his childhood like?
So he was born in this village called Onalua, and in the Kasai province in Congo. And he was taught by American missionaries, which I found interesting. His first contact with outsiders was with Americans who educated him at the missionary near him. And there were many missionaries, mostly Belgian in the Congo, but some American as well. And he was baptized by an American. And his teachers were very frustrated with him. He's clearly a precocious, but also rebellious boy. And he then, in his teenage years, early 20s, he eventually moved to the city of Stanleyville, as it was known at the time, which was a major regional center. And that's really where he began his political and professional rise.
I'll stick a map of that in the corner of the screen. So when he gets there, at what point did he start, like what age did he start working? I know he worked as a postal worker. He was also like a beer salesman or something.
Mm-hmm.
Like when did he go to work?
I think it was probably his late teens or early 20s. And yeah, he became a postal clerk. So he's joining the administration, the Belgian administration. He went to postal school, as I mentioned. Mm-hmm. And for, I think, 11 years was a postal clerk. That ended very poorly when he was caught embezzling money from the accounts that businesses kept at the post office.
What was he doing there?
His defense was that he had run out of money and was trying to live as a Europeanized Congolese man in Stanleyville. He, had magazine subscriptions and he wanted to send his kids to a good school and eat proper food. And so he basically just ran out of money, and his solution was stealing from the post office. The book was really thrown at him, and he was, it's sort of complicated to get into, but he was punished not just for the embezzlement, which was real and happened, but also for his sort of political activism, his nascent pushing back against the colonial system.
When had that really started, and how did that develop? Like, did he start groups himself right away, or did he have, maybe the better question is, did he have clear heroes that he looked up to from a political standpoint that inspired him to look at his own situation in Congo?
Yeah, I mean, it developed slowly. So remember, the broader context here is the Belgians were trying to keep the Congolese politically stunted, yes, and not connected with each other, and, banning various books and that sort of thing. So his political consciousness, I'd say, developed more slowly than perhaps his counterparts in other African countries. But it did develop, and over the course of the late 50s, it really took off. And he basically started out in public life as strategically sort of defending the Belgians, asking for very limited reform, saying, I don't want to overthrow the whole system. I just think we should make certain changes to reduce discrimination, that sort of thing. And then over just a matter of years, really, he turned into the anti-colonial activist that we would all come to know. But he didn't start out that way.
Were there catastrophic events that turned him? Were there times where, I don't know, like Belgian officials massacred citizens for random shit for no reason, or things like that kind of like straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah, well, so for him personally, he was arrested for embezzlement, as I mentioned, and was in prison over the course of 1956. And then, I mean, a really key turning point in all this history is in January 1959. There are what were known as the Leopoldville riots. Leopoldville was the capital at the time, and the Belgian administration had denied the right for a political group to hold a meeting, and that turned into these days of riots where the population just really rose up and was destroying everything. And that was super important because it convinced the Belgians, who had imagined that they'd be holding on to their colony long into the future, we need to give this up. We can't hold on. The winds of change are coming to Africa, and the population isn't just going to accept being oppressed. And so that really changed everything with the 1959 riots.
All right, so back to Lumumba, though. He becomes this kind of political leader. That's what was a little confusing to me. It seemed like it happened awfully quickly. Like he went from a postal worker to like, oh, you're gonna be the new prime minister when this stuff goes down. Like who did he become friends with, and like how did that categorically large rise happen so fast?
Yeah, so it did happen really quickly, and that is a function of the whole Congolese political class basically didn't exist in the mid-50s, and suddenly in 1960 you had to have politicians and people in charge. So Lumumba, his journey was, he was arrested, as I mentioned, spent time in jail, wrote a book while he was in jail expressing his political views at the time, which in retrospect seemed quite moderate. And then after getting out of prison, he became a beer promoter. He moved to the capital, Leopoldville, worked for a brewery, and that really allowed him to, be a very public man about town. And sort of in that atmosphere of beer in Leopoldville, he morphed into politics and co-founded this political party, the Congolese National Movement, that was, there were other political groups as well. And then as, 58 turned into 59, turned into 60, it was very, suddenly the demands for independence were growing louder and louder, and suddenly Belgium finally realized that it couldn't just keep ignoring them.
So if he turned that fast and did it after prison, like I would think with the control the Belgians had over the country, if a political dissident in this case, who's a convicted criminal in their eyes, sitting in prison is writing a book, like wouldn't they just not let that be published? Like how did a lot of people read it?
Or it wasn't published actually. It was, but not due to censorship, I'd say. It was, he mailed it off to some publisher and then never heard back. They weren't interested. It maybe wasn't even that good. But the important thing to keep in mind is the Belgians were really losing control. They had exerted control successfully for decades, but then very quickly they were not able, the demands were growing, and they looked around at the rest of Africa and they see in Algeria, there's a war being fought against the French, and Belgium thinks, okay, we don't want that.
Right.
In Indonesia, the Dutch had faced a similar type war against them, and Belgium realized, okay, we actually don't want an anti-colonial war. We've had this colony for a long time. It's time to offload it quickly.
So it seems like it was all it seems similar to, say, the Arab Spring in 2011 in the sense that one country kind of starts doing some and the other countries follow. Is that
in a way,
the
like
uprising?
There was, over the course of the late 1950s, there were all sorts of independence movements across the continent where, and they were talking to each other. They met with each other at these Pan-African conferences. Lumumba went to those. And in 1960, there were actually 17 nations that became independent that year. So it all moved very quickly.
Where were these conferences, these Pan-African conferences, like in secret, or where would they do them?
Well, some of them were in, for instance, Ghana, which had become independent in 1957, so you could hold a conference there. openly because it was no longer under European control.
But they wouldn't be killed when they went back?
Well, so Lumumba was allowed to go to this conference because things were sort of changing by the very end, and Belgium, for instance, denied another politician, Joseph Kasavubu, from attending the conference, but they let Lumumba go. Maybe they didn't think he was as much of a threat. So they were starting to sort of very tentatively permit various forms of political discussion.
How nice of them. Thank you for watching the video, guys. Please hit that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.